The Loxahatchee River Battlefield Park is one of the most historically significant multi-level sites in the town of Jupiter in Palm Beach County, southeastern Florida. Prehistoric and more modern habitation has occurred along the Loxahatchee River dating as far back as the Archaic period over 5,000 years ago. The primary purpose of the park today is to preserve and protect these cultural resources while providing education and passive recreation opportunities for the public to experience this beautiful place and its history. A small group of Seminole Native American Indians had everything at stake when they fought more than 1,500 United States troops and volunteers at the Loxahatchee River in 1838. If defeated, the Seminoles would be forced to leave their home and head west to Oklahoma reservations on the Trail of Tears. The southern portion of the Trail of Tears started in Jupiter, Florida. Their African American allies, who had joined the Seminoles' cause after escaping from southern plantations, would be sold back into slavery and brutally punished for fleeing and attempting to stand up for their freedom. Incredibly, the battlefield where these Seminole Indians and African Americans fought and died was nearly lost forever over the following 150 years. Early settlers changed the landscape of the battlefield and surrounding environment, clearing and draining what was once a nearly impenetrable swamp to plant orange groves and citrus farms. The area eventually became a trailer park before Palm Beach County bought the land in 1978, unaware that the grounds still held the soldiers' buttons and musket balls. The land sat empty, unmentioned in guidebooks, unknown to many locals for nearly 2 more decades. Local historians rediscovered the battlefield in the early 1990s, and it has since been turned into a beautiful park open to the public, known as Riverbend Park or as the Loxahatchee Battleground Park. South of Indiantown Road, just off of I-95, inside this quiet park, it is still possible to imagine the past. After the American Revolutionary War, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. Subsequently, Spain granted land to the Native American Indians to set up farms and develop the land. At the same time, because the state was under Spanish control, escaped fugitive black slaves took advantage of the treaty and found refuge in Florida. These two developments pushed the United States government to begin what became known as the First Seminole War from 1817 to 1818 on the Florida-Georgia border, which drove the Seminoles even further south. In 1821, the United States bought Florida from Spain for $5 million. By this point in time, Florida was a haven for American Indians who had been pushed out of the more settled areas and also for the black fugitives who had risked their lives to escape from slavery. The Seminole Indians harbored hundreds of black runaways, some of whom served as Spanish militia. The Seminoles became known as Red or Black Seminoles and banded together in unison to protect themselves and their right to freedom. Many of the black Seminoles could speak the native languages along with English and Spanish. Immediately after the acquisition of Florida, the United States government began urging the Seminole Indians to leave their lands and to relocate, along with other southeastern tribes, to the Indian Territory, which is in present-day Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders signed a treaty in 1832, and part of the tribe did move, but other Seminoles refused to recognize the treaty and fled into the Florida Everglades. In May of 1832, the Treaty of Payne's Landing required all Indians living in the eastern and southern United States to forfeit their land and move west of the Mississippi River within a 3-year window. In 1835, 3 years later, the United States Army arrived in Florida to enforce this treaty and found the Seminoles prepared to fight. President Andrew Jackson, who was in office from 1829 to 1837, scoffed at the treaties that the U.S. had signed in the past, granting land in Florida to the Seminoles, and he ordered all of the rest of them west to Oklahoma. Major General Thomas Jessup, an Army officer with a 52-year-long military career, warned Jackson that if the Seminoles were not defeated and removed, more black slaves would escape their chains and join in the resistance. Ultimately, a series of 3 wars, known as the Seminole or the Florida Wars, were fought between the years of 1816 and 1858, not just to take or reclaim land for the white settlers, but also to protect the institution of slavery. For decades, the Seminoles successfully resisted the U.S. military. When the U.S. Army arrived in Florida in 1835 to formally enforce their treaty, the Indians were ready for war. Multiple battles, fights, and skirmishes took place during this time all throughout the state of Florida. The campaigns of the Second Seminole War, sometimes called the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the U.S. government against the Native American Indians. The U.S. spent more than $20 million fighting the Seminoles, and the war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. The obvious duplicity of the U.S. government's tactics marred Indian and white relationships throughout the country for generations. 2 significant battles were fought at this location at what is present-day Loxahatchee River Battleground Park. The first battle at Loxahatchee took place on January 15, 1838, near the eastern edge of the park. This battle is referred to as Powell's Battle. It was commanded by Lieutenant Levin M. Powell of the United States Navy's Waterborne Everglades Expeditionary Unit, composed of inexperienced naval and Army personnel. Powell and his unit, in search of Seminole villages, entered the southwest fork of the Loxahatchee River in small boats, led by a captured Seminole woman. Marching west, they saw smoke trails rising from a cypress swamp encampment and were suddenly met with hot musket fire from Seminole warriors. A running fire fight in the swamp, led by Chiefs Tuskegee and Loxahatchee, ended at dark when the Seminoles slowly regained control. Powell's small force of 80 sailors and soldiers were overpowered by a much larger force of Seminole swamp fighters. They were soundly defeated by the Seminoles, who routed Lieutenant Levin Powell and his Navy force, killing 4, including their physician, and wounding 22. The hero of this engagement was Joseph E. Johnston, who took over charge and directed a rear guard action, barely preventing what might have become known as Powell's Massacre. Nine days later, on January 24, 1838, the second battle at Loxahatchee took place. This battle is referred to as Jessup's Battle. Notified that Powell had definitely located a group of Seminoles, Major General Thomas S. Jessup brought his army overland from Fort Pierce, passing west of the St. Lucie River and approaching the Seminole encampment from the west. Jessup had a force of about 1,500 men, 600 dragoons under the command of Colonel William S. Harney, 400 artillery under Colonel Lemuel Gates, 400 Tennessee volunteers under Major William Lauderdale, 100 Alabama volunteers, and 35 Delaware Indian scouts. On the afternoon of January 24th, these 1,500 men, under the leadership of General Jessup, met only about 300 Seminoles, about half of whom were black, in the dense hammock on the western banks of the Loxahatchee River, in what would become the last standing battle of the Second Seminole War. Jessup's men attacked with support from cannons and Congreve rockets, but the Seminoles were experienced guerrilla fighters. They attacked General Jessup's advanced guard of dragoons and led the soldiers into the cypress swamps. The Seminoles hid in the trees and fired down on the soldiers at close range from within the dense hammock. However, outnumbered more than 5 to 1, the Seminoles were forced to retreat to watery strongholds on the opposite side of the river, the eastern banks, and were forced to wait for the troops to follow. Major William Lauderdale and his Tennessee volunteers held a position on the west side of the river and were now in direct line of musket fire that stopped their advance. After dismounting and drawing his pistol, General Jessup ordered the Tennesseans to follow him as he charged ahead. Instead, they refused to follow and held their position, and an enraged Jessup charged ahead alone. Dangerously exposed, he turned his head to see why the men had not followed him, and his glasses were shot off his face. He was wounded and forced to fall back. The battle ended when Colonel William Harney's dragoons outflanked the Seminoles, who fled into the Everglades. The Tennessee volunteers, led by Major William Lauderdale, took most of the casualties. At least 9 volunteers and 7 soldiers were killed at this battle, and 31 were wounded, along with an unknown number of Seminoles. A U.S. Army surgeon named Jacob Mott witnessed the battle and wrote about it. He claimed that the uproar of the battle was stunning. The Indians yelled and shrieked, the rifles cracked, and their balls whistled. The musketry rattled, the Congreve rockets whizzed, and the artillery bellowed, and the shells burst. His writings were so descriptive that more than 100 years later, they have helped archaeologists, preservationists, and volunteers guess and surmise where these battles actually took place. After the battles of the Loxahatchee, General Jessup petitioned Washington to allow the Seminoles to remain in the Everglades and thus bring an end to the war. However, Washington denied Jessup's request. 600 Seminoles were captured under a white flag of truce at Fort Jupiter. The Seminole warriors continued to resist removal for another 2 decades, until the last of the Seminole Wars ended in 1858, and some never surrendered. Archaeological digs reveal that a surviving few returned to the Loxahatchee River, living in what is present-day Riverbend Park until well into the 1870s. The exact location of both battlefields was unclear for most of the 20th century. At one time, it was incorrectly identified as having taken place in the modern-day Jonathan Dickinson State Park, with a marker placed there accordingly. In the 1980s, numerous archaeologists, not all of them working together, concluded Jessup's battle occurred in Jupiter Farms along the Loxahatchee River Northwest Fork, around and south of Indiantown Road. An extensive archaeological survey by professionals confirmed the location of the battlefield, as well as numerous Seminole and pre-Seminole archaeological sites in Riverbend Trailer Park. The part of the park identified as where Jessup's battle took place is today known as Loxahatchee River Battlefield Park. The exact location of Powell's battle is less clear, but probably occurred east of Riverbend Park. Richard Prosick, a former Miami Beach police detective who retired to Jupiter, is one of many people who have spent years looking for the exact locations that took place at Loxahatchee River. Prosick always wanted to be an archaeologist, and in the 1980s, he discovered the Seminole War-era encampment of the Tennessee Volunteers in his own backyard. For years after that, he continued to search for the battlefield in vain, going up and down the river in his canoe. In the early 1990s, he knew he had found it. Archaeologists submitted a report to the county in 1994 saying that they had found remains from both the Powell and Jessup battles at what was then known as the Riverbend Trailer Park. A 300-year-old oak tree grows on top of an ancient Indian shell mound on the far western side of the park. Prosick believes that the soldiers laid their dead and wounded on the dry land provided by the tree, dragging them out of the swamp as they fell. Farther north, just a few yards south of Indiantown Road, archaeologists have unearthed musket balls that were never fired. Prosick believes the Tennessee Volunteers crouched there in what was once a dense hammock, dropping the musket balls as they tried to reload. A group of citizens of Palm Beach County, Florida, met in February of 2007 to form an organization to preserve, enhance, and protect the Second Seminole War battlefield. The Loxahatchee Battlefield Preservationists is now a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting this important land and its inhabitants while educating the public on the significant battles that occurred here in 1838. Each year, from October through May, the group provides walking battlefield tours, history of the park lectures, historical battle reenactments, and many more educational opportunities. The names of the two battles have not been historically consistent. Older sources sometimes erroneously refer to Powell's battle as the Battle of Jupiter Inlet, probably because contemporary newspaper accounts described it as occurring near the inlet. The modern name of both battles refers to the Loxahatchee River, not the community of Loxahatchee. Loxahatchee is an anglicized version of the waterway's Seminole name for Turtle River. Historical spellings have also varied widely as well. Well, that's everything I know about the Loxahatchee River Battlefield Park and everything I've learned about these two important battles in the Second Seminole War. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time in another one.